Part 2. Mask Science. Side Effects. Part 3. Mask Psychology and Motivation. Symbolism is a primitive but effective way of communicating ideas. The use of an emblem or flag to symbolize some system, idea, institution, or personality is a shortcut from mind to mind. Robert H. Jackson, Supreme Court Justice and Chief Prosecutor in the Nuremberg Trials, in West Virginia State Board of Education et al. V. Barnett et al., June 14, 1943. The thing most likely to guide a person's behavioral decisions isn't the most potent or instructive aspect of the whole situation. Instead, it's the one that is most prominent in consciousness at the time of the decision. Robert Cialdini, Influence, New and Expanded, 2021. Mask Speech. In March and April 2020, almost overnight, the world developed a mania for face masks. People who had never put on a mask in their life were suddenly wearing them when walking alone outside. I was living in El Paso, Texas at the time, and lost count of the number of people I saw wearing face masks, even when walking alone outside, driving in their cars, or walking with family members. As late as December 2022, there were still plenty of people wearing face masks in outdoor areas like grocery store parking lots. Intuitively, one would expect most mask wearing to be motivated by altruism, politeness, reasonable fear, a sensibly prudent desire to avoid giving or receiving an infection, or some combination thereof. Certainly, these were and still are the most commonly ascribed motivations for mask wearing in publications from the Los Angeles Times to editorials in the British Medical Journal. The least altruistic motivation attributed to mask wearing was completely understandable crippling anxiety in the face of a new Spanish flu. Paired with this was a widespread self-righteous vitriolic refusal to credit similar beneficent motivations to those who resisted mask wearing. To wear a face mask is an expression of deep goodwill toward your fellow humans, opined one writer, continuing, "My glasses slip off the bridge of my nose because they can't hold to the cloth, and still I wear a mask. Why? Because I'm not a selfish jerk." Another author in Psychology Today semi-jokingly proposed a new diagnosis for people who refused to wear masks: antisocial masking disorder, characterized by consistent irresponsibility, lack of remorse, recklessness, and violation of the physical or emotional rights of others. Exactly which physical or emotional rights was never specified. Letters, opinions, and editorials castigating the brainless behavior by childish non-maskers with weapons-grade selfishness were aired prominently and widely. Those who refused to wear masks were denied services and expelled from stores. Healthcare providers who questioned masking were treated as committing malfeasance or worse. Dr. Stephen Latulip, MD, was one of the few physicians with enough courage to go on record opposing compulsory mask wearing and had his license summarily revoked by the Oregon Medical Board for propagating such dangerous heresy. In a nod to George Orwell's 1984, Dilbert author and social commentator Scott Adams coined the term loserthink to refer to dysfunctional habits of thinking. Loserthink mind reading was rampant in editorial after editorial where writers speculated on the reasons behind many people's supposedly baffling refusal to fulfill their civic duty and moral obligation to wear masks. Some suggested reasons, like differing risk assessments or allusions to psychological factors, got at part of the truth. Others were wildly off the mark, such as one academic's assessment that anti-maskers are not afraid of losing their freedom, they're afraid of facing the reality of their own mortality. Fear of mortality had nothing to do with it. Politicians and other authority figures helped fan natural tension into open mutual hostility by consistently putting the worst possible spin on refusal to wear masks, with a lack of self-awareness which will make them barn-sized targets for criticism in high school papers for generations to come. Many of the same people who mandated masks then went on to decry the politicization of mask wearing, which was a direct result of their own actions. These superficial and often self-flattering popular assessments sidestepped the real issues and motives underlying most people's decision to put on a mask or resist doing so. While fear of infection for either oneself or others was certainly a primary motivation for some, overall it played a relatively small part in most people's decision to wear a mask. As we will see, psychological studies looking at possible motivations for mask wearing often ruled out many possibilities by their experimental design. For example, the only directly motivation-oriented questions used in a 2021 Swiss study of mask wearing offered a binary choice between altruism and risk aversion, a desire to protect oneself or a desire to protect others, excluding other possible motives from consideration. While it will come as no surprise to anyone that greater risk aversion heavily predicted mask wearing, a desire to avoid infection or to protect others were far from the only reasons people might have to wear or not wear a mask. A 2020 Japanese study cast a wider net by looking at 6 potential psychological drivers of mask wearing: altruism, self-interest, perceived severity of the disease, personal relief from anxiety, do whatever you can attitude, and conformity to a perceived social norm, framed in question form as, when you see other people wearing masks, do you think that you should wear a mask? Contrary to expectation and popular rhetoric, the expectation of risk reduction, personal or collective, explained only a small portion of mask usage. Instead, the researchers found that conformity to the social norm was the most prominent driving force for wearing masks. Behavioral psychologist Robert Cialdini summarizes the study. Although multiple reasons were measured, only one made a major difference in mask wearing frequency: seeing other people wearing masks. Mask wearing is a potent form of communication. The authors of the 2020 Japanese study not only recognized the communicative effect of masks, they explicitly endorsed using the psychological nudge effect it produced, stating, "Wearing masks can be a symbol of collective confrontation against a pandemic. We encourage policymakers to apply the effects of the social norm on the wearing of masks to promote collective efforts to combat COVID-19. Similarly, researchers writing in the academic journal Anxiety, Stress, and Coping acknowledged that mask wearing within certain contexts represents a sign of conformity with accepted social norms, and described following mask wearing directives as a way to express communal responsibility for combating the pandemic. The social psychologists Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein highlighted the social influences inherent in mask wearing in their book, Nudge. Social influences come in 2 basic categories. The first involves information. If many people do something or think something, their actions and their thoughts convey information about what is best for you to do or think. If people are picking up after their dogs, buckling their seatbelts, driving under the speed limit, saving for retirement, treating people equally, or wearing masks, you might think that is the right thing to do. The second involves peer pressure. If you care about what other people think about you, perhaps in the mistaken belief that they are paying some attention to what you are doing, then you might go along with the crowd to avoid their wrath or curry their favor. In some places during the COVID-19 pandemic, you'd get a cold stare or worse if you weren't wearing a mask in a public place. And in some places, you'd get a cold stare or worse if you were wearing a mask. This gets at one of the core issues at the heart of much resistance to masking. More often than not, people who refused to wear masks did not want to communicate that wearing masks was the right thing to do, and resisted because they consciously or intuitively recognized that this was exactly what wearing masks communicated. They recognized the message inherent in mask wearing. "It's a garment that has a strong visual impact," says Lauren Fajardo, one of the owners of Cuban fashion brand Dador. "It is also a way to express yourself. I don't even have to talk for someone to see what I'm trying to say with my face mask." Since 2020, the symbolic speech and expressive conduct inherent in mask wearing has been widely and explicitly acknowledged, even exploited, by people on both sides of the political spectrum. On May 12, 2020, Governor of New York Andrew Cuomo declared, "This mask says I respect the nurses and the doctors. This mask says I respect the essential workers who get up every day and drive the bus, or drive the train, or deliver the food, or keep the lights on so that I can stay home and I can stay safe. It says I respect others, and I respect you, and that is a statement that we should all be willing to make any day, but especially in the middle of this." As early as July 2020, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz complained that masks had become a political statement rather than a public health statement. Both of these governors' statements affirmed that masks are speech no matter what angle they are viewed from. In 2020, President Trump reportedly refused to wear a mask because doing so would send the wrong message, and was widely criticized for this stance by the mainstream media. When 94-year-old Queen Elizabeth II did not wear a mask during her public appearance in October 2020, commentators worried that by not wearing one, the Queen was potentially sending the wrong message. The authors of a 2020 perspective published in the New England Journal of Medicine wrote, "It is also clear that masks serve symbolic roles. Masks are not only tools, they are also talismans. It says to those around us that whatever our vaccine status, we value community safety," wrote Dana Stevens in The Atlantic. Publications from a children's book titled Wearing a Mask Says I Love You to political cartoons such as Ben Garrison's The Masks Speak clearly recognized the fact that masks are a form of speech. Even Dr. Fauci acknowledged the symbolic communication inherent in mask wearing, and he did so very early on in a May 2020 interview when he said, "I want to make it be a symbol for people to see that that's the kind of thing you should be doing." Dr. Fauci reaffirmed this a year later in May 2021 during an appearance on Good Morning America when he described the CDC's ever-changing mask policies. "I am now much more comfortable in people seeing me indoors without a mask. Before the CDC made the recommendation change, I didn't want to look like I was giving mixed signals." Even before COVID, the symbolic and communicative properties of mask wearing were ingrained in the societal subconscious. The very word mask connotes pretense and concealment. Popular and scientific literature both reflect this. In his 2005 book, False Alarm: The Truth About the Epidemic of Fear, Dr. Mark Siegel observed, "Respiratory masks and other paraphernalia meant to shield us actually spread panic more effectively than any terrorist agent by sending the message that something is in the offing." One of the many studies we reviewed in part 1 of this book was a 2009 masking study of hospital workers in Japan. In addition to finding no protective benefits against upper respiratory infections from wearing surgical masks, the authors of this 2009 study further noted that wearing a face mask may also communicate to the other party that the individual with the mask is either 1. Infectious, or 2. Thinks the person they are talking with is infectious. Similarly, the author of a 2018 research article discussed his clinical findings regarding the subtype of process addiction known as mask dependency. He quoted one mask wearer who was quite clear about what wearing a mask communicates. "When I went out, I always wore a mask as an indication of my intention to refuse to interact with people." A 2021 literature review of the effects of mask wearing on social anxiety noted that among individuals with social anxiety disorder, there are certain safety behaviors that resemble the function of mask wearing, including tendencies to hide their face and wear clothes or makeup to hide blushing. Safety behaviors are a normal part of reducing or coping with anxiety and things that cause it, but when taken to extremes, they can become maladaptive and ultimately worsen the anxiety they are meant to alleviate. When questioned by members of the British Parliament, David Halpern, the psychologist heading up the UK's Behavioural Insights team, infamously known as the Nudge Unit, not only drew attention to both the communicative and symbolic effect of masks, but also pointed out the self-contradictory nature of the surrounding mandates, given that the marginally more effective viral control measure of hand washing was not mandated. During a Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee hearing on January 19, 2021, Halpern stated, "It took a long time to get people in masks. Our view early on was that masks are effective, not least because of the signal they create, and of course the underlying evidence. And of course I gave you an example on hand washing where we did a number of trials and we found this was more effective. The evidence would suggest it was more effective and it wasn't taken up." Based on the results of her interviews with government officials, in her book A State of Fear, journalist Laura Dodsworth elaborated on the underlying psychological mechanism involved, where she also highlighted Halpern's admission. "Behavioral psychologists love masks. They absolutely love them. They believe they promote collectivism, the feeling that we are all in it together. This attitude, clearly gleaned from my interviews with the Spy B advisors, was confirmed when David Halpern answered MP's questions. How does the signal work? Normative pressure is enhanced and sustained when we wear masks in public. They are a visible indicator that there is danger present all around, in the air we breathe and in the people we meet. Masked faces prime you to think of danger. We become walking billboards for disease and danger. They keep fear in our faces, literally." Ms. Dodsworth's analysis has strong evidential support from popular and scientific sources. It is far from some fringe take. Most people will intuitively recognize the truth in her words. Even the Director General of the World Health Organization, Tedros Ghebreyesus, explicitly made this connection when he proclaimed on August 3, 2020, "The mask has come to represent solidarity." He went on to urge healthcare workers in particular to "show us your solidarity in following national guidelines and safely wearing a mask, whether caring for patients or loved ones, riding on public transport to work, or picking up essential supplies. By wearing a mask, you're sending a powerful message to those around you that we are all in this together." Masks enhanced and perpetuated the anxieties they were supposed to alleviate. Psychiatrist Mark McDonald succinctly assessed the communicative and psychological effect of masking for COVID-19, saying, "Perhaps the greatest tool government has wielded in instigating and maintaining fear is the mask. Their function has been purely symbolic, an emblem of fear, anxiety, and compliance." Psychiatrist and bioethicist Erin Kheriaty wrote, "Masks became a potent symbol of physical purity and civic spirit, as well as a symbol of mutual mistrust during the pandemic." Robert Freudenthal, a psychiatrist in the UK National Health Service, writes about masking, "It suggests that, at its core, interpersonal relationships are the true drivers of illness, and therefore our interconnectedness and relational lives, rather than being the very essence of our humanity, become a risk that should be managed and ideally avoided. Masking gives off the message, 'I am an infection risk. You are an infection risk. We are to be avoided. Don't get close. I am better off away from you. Stay away.'" These properties of mask wearing were common knowledge prior to COVID. In a 2018 keynote address to the National Academy of Medicine, health journalist and World Economic Forum Global Health Security Advisory Board member Laurie Garrett answered a question about the scientific evidence underlying masking by describing a study out of Japan. "It seemed like the major efficacy of a mask is that it causes alarm in the other person." Times of declared emergency are often more dangerous to fundamental liberties than they are to life and limb. In 1943, in the middle of World War II, the United States Supreme Court courageously upheld the First Amendment when it ruled in West Virginia State Board of Education et al. V. Barnett et al. That saluting the American flag constituted a form of symbolic speech protected by the First Amendment and could not be compelled in violation of conscience, even during a national wartime emergency. In delivering the court's ruling, Justice Robert H. Jackson stated, "Symbolism is a primitive but effective way of communicating ideas. The use of an emblem or flag to symbolize some system, idea, institution, or personality is a shortcut from mind to mind." Masks are indisputably such an emblem and form of speech, and in the context of COVID, mask wearing became a perpetual salute. This has critical implications under the First Amendment, which we will explore in detail in Part 5. Masks are broad-spectrum symbolic declarations of caution, fear, and danger, of infectiousness or infectability. Everyone walking around with a mask on is effectively broadcasting that other people should wear a mask. Everyone walking around without a mask broadcasts the opposite. In particular, when perceived experts and medical authority figures like healthcare providers wear masks, it constitutes visual approval and social proof for these medical interventions and modified quarantine measures, as well as tacit endorsement of their moral and legal legitimacy. This social modeling and social proof speak and persuade more powerfully than any words. Behavioral psychologist Robert Cialdini perceptively observed that people have a natural tendency to think a statement reflects the true attitude of the person who made it. What is surprising is that they continue to think so even when they know the person did not freely choose to make the statement. The universal principle of ignore what they say and watch what they do means that even acts of protest like wearing masks with anti-mask messages printed on them simply serve to make protesting wearers self-contradictory hypocrites in the eyes of many viewers. After all, their convictions about masks being useless were not strong enough to prevent them from wearing one. Key takeaways. Mask wearing is an unusually potent and persuasive form of symbolic communication, as attested to by behavioral psychologists, psychiatrists, leaders on both sides of the political spectrum, and regular people from all walks of life. The stated primary motive for mask wearing, infection control, was not the actual primary motive for most wearers. Masks are us. Social influences on mask wearing. Behavioral psychology was weaponized to drive masking. In fact, compulsory masking has been one of the most visible and effective weaponizations of behavioral psychology in history. Even if one were to assume, for the sake of argument, that masks provide all of the infection control benefits erroneously ascribed to them, those benefits would still be dwarfed by their virulent communicative impact and toxic psychological effects. There are three psychologists in particular whose influential work helps explain not only why compulsory masking worked the way it did, but also how to combat it and similar manipulations in the future. These three are Solomon Asch and his conformity studies, Stanley Milgram and his studies on obedience to authority, and Philip Zimbardo with his work on the situational factors that lead otherwise good people to abuse power or do evil things. Compulsory masking occupies the space where these three bodies of work converge. In 1951, Solomon Asch conducted the first of his seminal conformity experiments. Subjects were recruited for what was presented to them as a simple group visual perception experiment. Subjects were part of a group shown straight lines anywhere from 2 to 10 inches long, and then asked to select the line of matching length from 3 adjacent choices. The catch was that each member of the group had to state their selection publicly, and apart from the actual research subject, each other member of the group giving answers was one of Asch's accomplices, who had been instructed to confidently state the same wrong answers for certain questions, thereby creating passive pressure to conform to an artificial consensus. Asch's experimental design trapped a subject between two contradictory and irreconcilable forces, the evidence of his own experience of an utterly clear perceptual fact and the unanimous evidence of a group of equals. What happens when a person is confronted by a group consensus of their peers which their own two eyes tell them is obviously wrong? Asch's control group showed a virtual absence of errors when matching the lines, and he initially predicted that relatively few people would conform to the group opinion by making demonstrably false statements. What Asch actually found, however, was that fully 3/4 of subjects acquiesced to the incorrect group answer at least once, and 30% of the subjects conformed to the wrong group answers the majority of the time. In the face of entirely passive but unanimous group pressure, only 26% of test subjects in Asch's initial experiment were able to maintain their complete independence and continue to give the correct answer. Even for those individuals who were able to maintain their independence, the act of contradicting even a non-antagonistic group majority was a clear source of substantial stress. Those who maintained their autonomy and gave the correct answers were careful to avoid bad-mouthing the group consensus even though their answers inescapably implied that the group was wrong. One of the strongest subjects who had maintained his autonomy would only go so far as to affirm the possibility that the group was wrong when pressed, saying, "You're probably right, but you may be wrong." When the nature of the experiment was finally disclosed to him, he described himself as exultant and relieved, adding that, "At times I had the feeling, to heck with it, I'll go along with the rest." In conducting exit interviews with his subjects and analyzing his experimental results, Asch found that those who succumbed to group influence and gave the wrong answer generally fell into 3 categories: those whose actions were distorted, those whose judgments were distorted, and those whose perceptions were distorted. Those whose actions were distorted did not think their judgment was wrong, but yielded to the group out of a need not to appear different, inferior, or cause friction with the group. Those whose judgments were distorted thought that because everyone else in the group saw the lines a certain way, their own ability to judge the length of the lines was most likely in error, and so joined the group, denying the evidence of their own eyes. Finally, and most remarkably, the third subset of those who yielded to group pressure reported being unaware of any inconsistency between the group verdict and their own perceptions. In a way, the discomfort of seeing something different from the group consensus caused these subjects to actually see what the other group members merely said they saw. Their perceptions changed to fit the group descriptions. Solomon Asch's experiments demonstrated that even when we have personal, undeniable, factual knowledge, the mere condition of being surrounded by peers who demonstrate a consensus, even when no threats or direct interaction are involved, creates pressure to conform which only a minority of people resist completely and which no one resists without effort. Moreover, most people have no conscious awareness when this is occurring. When Solomon Asch inverted his experiment, using a majority of test subjects but adding a single accomplice who consistently dissented by giving wrong answers, the majority did not take the dissenter seriously. They even found him amusing. Contagious laughter spread through the group at the droll minority. However, when Asch increased the number of accomplices giving the wrong answer to at least 3, he found that the attitude of derision in the majority turns to seriousness and increased respect. While subsequent modifications to Asch's experimental template highlighted variations of outcome based on circumstance, gender, and culture, Asch's initial core findings have been repeatedly replicated and validated. Keep in mind, too, that the pressure to conform increases with the stakes. Asch's experiments involved a trivial disagreement, matching the length of lines on paper. Dissent from the group could not reasonably be characterized as harming others the way refusing to wear a mask often was. Solomon Asch's findings are directly applicable to mask wearing. As the authors of a 2022 study published in BMC Public Health stated, behavior is contagious. When governments impose face mask regulations, this enforces a social norm that subsequently stimulates the advocated behavior because people want to conform to the group standard. This study surveyed nearly 7,000 students from 10 countries and found that by far the strongest predictor of mask wearing was the stringency of mask mandates. Mandates got people to wear masks. Conversely, even though fear for personal safety correlated with mask wearing, concern for others had no substantial impact on mask wearing behavior. The study also found that international students were significantly more likely to report wearing masks, possibly because their social status as foreign nationals was less secure, forcing them to attune more closely to the visible group consensus. All of these findings are consistent with results from Japan and other countries, and they point to social science rather than medical science as the real driving imperative for masking. Masking was a form of conspicuous caring, and mask mandates were coerced conspicuous caring. In public health lingo, masks were a vector for transmitting infectious, obsessive, debilitating, fear-based groupthink, and decisions to wear a mask were rarely as altruistic or selfless as propaganda made them out to be. Solomon Asch's study yielded further important findings. He also observed that once a subject had yielded to the group, they continued to yield more than previously independent subjects. Asch explained, having once committed himself to yielding, the individual finds it difficult and painful to change his direction. To do so is tantamount to a public admission that he has not acted rightly. He therefore follows the precarious course he has already chosen in order to maintain an outward semblance of consistency and conviction. This is another lever of influence activated by masking, and we will examine it in more depth later. The conformity effect created by a group extends even to morality, because people apprehend moral realities and experience moral convictions similarly to how they apprehend and experience other aspects of the external world. In a 2012 study, 80% of tested college students shifted their views of torture from being morally unacceptable to a more favorable stance after being convinced that the majority of their peers in a laboratory group had a more favorable view of the use of torture in interrogations. As mentioned earlier, there are two components of group conformity: informational and social normative. Group behavior communicates information and constitutes its own type of highly influential evidence known as social proof. Communicating this social proof is known as social modeling. Robert Cialdini describes how this works. We determine what is correct by finding out what other people think is correct. We view an action as correct in a given situation to the degree that we see others performing it. Following the advice or behaviors of the majority of those around us is often seen as a shortcut to good decision-making. We use the actions of others as a way to locate and validate a correct choice. If everybody's raving about a new restaurant, it's probably a good one that we'd like too. If the great majority of online reviewers is recommending a product, we'll likely feel more confident clicking the purchase button. Who we witness taking actions also makes a difference. If we see someone we view as an expert or authority on the subject doing something, we are more likely to follow their example than we would be if it is a peer or someone we dislike. This made the sight of healthcare providers wearing masks an especially potent form of social proof. In his study, Asch also noted that the majority effect grows stronger as the situation diminishes in clarity. Thus, conformity is higher when we are personally in a state of uncertainty, and the effective social proof becomes stronger the more people we witness doing something. As shown by Ash's and subsequent experiments, group behavior is so powerfully persuasive that it can go so far as to create doubt and uncertainty where none previously existed and none would normally exist. Simply hearing a decisive pronouncement by their peers led many of Ash's subjects to doubt the evidence of their own two eyes when viewing something less than 6 feet away, evidence whose accuracy at judging object size and distance they otherwise took for granted and depended on every day when navigating and interacting with the world around them. Using group consensus as a shortcut to effective decision-making is not entirely irrational. It is an intuitive form of playing the odds, and most of the time has a net beneficial survival value. In fact, as professional risk analyst Douglas Hubbard has pointed out, in certain contexts, such as when people are spending their own money in prediction markets, aggregating opinions is better at forecasting than almost any of the individual participants in the market are. Participants have an incentive not only to consider the questions carefully, but even, especially when a lot of money is involved, to expend their own resources to get new information to analyze about the investment. Often, this flexible willingness to reevaluate and possibly modify beliefs previously held with certainty, based simply on social context or social modeling, is one of humanity's greatest strengths. On an individual level, emulating others can be a great spur to self-improvement and even rapid relief from fear. Memorable exceptions to this general rule notwithstanding, children at the dental office who witness a sibling or peer behaving in a non-anxious manner will more often than not be less anxious themselves once they climb into the chair. Psychologist Albert Bandura found that more than half, 55%, of a study group of nursery school-aged children who were initially terrified of dogs were willing to climb into a playpen with the dog and remain there, petting and scratching the dog, even when alone, after just 4 sessions of positive modeling from a peer. Just 13% of the control group which did not get the benefit of positive peer modeling were willing to do this. All of us can recall childhood and adult experiences that confirm these experimental findings, as well as personal examples of fears that are resistant to calming peer influences. Key takeaways. Solomon Asch's behavioral psychology experiments on group conformity demonstrate the powerful influence that even passive pressure from peer group modeling can have on individual behavior and beliefs. Behaviors like mask wearing are more contagious than any virus. Deluding the masses. Herd wisdom is far from infallible, however. It works best when individuals have the freedom to choose whether or not to follow the herd, but even then, mass delusions are regular occurrences. Charles Mackay catalogued many of these in his 1841 3-volume book set on the madness of crowds. Christopher Booker and Richard North added to this list in their 2007 book, Scared to Death. Though individual readers are certain to disagree with these authors about particular issues listed as delusions, they are also certain to find far more points of agreement. On a cultural and scientific level, social proof and modeling are simultaneously necessary for, and obstacles to, innovation, moral development, and the general advancement of knowledge. Virtually every current scientific tenet was a minority belief at one time. A dedicated minority with moral or empirical insight can use social influence processes to alter society for the better. The Western eradication of slavery happened through just such persistent efforts by a dedicated minority. However, the strength inherent in this mental flexibility includes an unavoidable corresponding vulnerability. The same process can normalize acceptance of false facts or morally degenerate behavior. Change can occur with astonishing rapidity in either direction, depending on the sources of influence. Ancient wisdom literature is replete with instructions highlighting the double-edged nature of this elemental human characteristic. The ancient Egyptian Wisdom of Ptah-hotep, one of the oldest books in the world, instructs, "If you are weak, follow a man of excellence, and all your conduct will be good before God." The biblical book of Proverbs says, "Walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm." And, "Do not make friends with a hot-tempered person. Do not associate with one easily angered, or you may learn their ways and get yourself ensnared." The common thread in these aphorisms is an understanding that while we cannot completely control the influence others have on us, we can choose our company with conscious awareness of this fact. Badness and fear are contagious, but so are goodness and courage. Ancient readers were urged to carefully and intentionally select their social models, keeping in mind the effects these will have on their own actions and beliefs. The other paramount driving impulse for group conformity comes from a primal social need. In his book, The Lucifer Effect, Understanding How Good People Turn Evil, psychologist Philip Zimbardo explains, other people are more likely to accept us when we agree with them than when we disagree, so we yield to their view of the world, driven by a powerful need to belong, to replace differences with similarities. At bottom, the social need to conform is not simply a desire for approval, a desire to receive assistance, or a need to grease the wheels of collaboration. Whereas the information conveyed by social proof and social modeling may or may not help us survive and thrive as individuals, the group itself can and often does become a direct threat to our individual survival. Remaining part of the main group, or at least not being perceived by that group as a threat that needs to be neutralized or eliminated, is a matter of brutal survival that we all recognize on a visceral level. We are very reasonably extremely hesitant about anything which could jeopardize our status in this regard. History is littered with the bodies of those who were thrust into an outgroup, often against their will, based on physical, religious, social, and political differences. The results of Solomon Asch's experiments predict that even if everyone knew for a fact going into 2020 that masks were useless against respiratory viruses, once the practice of mask wearing took hold, only a minority of people would resist wearing a mask in all situations, and even then, doing so would require conscious effort and involve a great deal of personal discomfort. Passive social pressure alone would be strong enough to get about 3/4 of people to wear masks at least some of the time, and about a third of people would wear masks all or most of the time. But mask wearing during COVID was much greater than this. In Solomon Asch's experiments, pressure from the group was mostly implicit and indirect rather than overt, and certainly not aggressive in any physical sense. What happens when indirect, passive pressure to conform becomes direct pressure to obey? 10 years after Asch published his initial findings, Stanley Milgram began conducting another groundbreaking series of experiments to answer this question. Unless painful self-knowledge can be considered an injury, Milgram's genius was to acquire this knowledge without injuring anyone. Stanley Milgram's subjects believed that they were participating in an experiment to determine how learning and memory were affected by the use of punishment. In reality, they participated in an experiment to see how far ordinary men and women will go in obedience to authority. Subjects believed they were acting as a teacher, administering tests of word pairs to a learner, and flipping switches to give increasingly severe shocks with every wrong answer. The shocks started at 15 volts and went all the way up to 450 volts in 15-volt increments, with one dedicated switch per shock. The panel of switches had additional labels describing the voltages, running from slight shock, moderate shock, and strong shock to very strong shock, intense shock, and extreme intensity shock. The 375-volt switch was marked with danger, severe shock. The final two 435 and 450-volt switches were simply marked with XXX, possibly because a skull and crossbones would have been too over the top. Before starting, the teacher subjects were given a sense of what they were doing to the learner, as well as further convincing proof of the experiment's veracity, when they received a 45-volt shock administered by flipping the third switch. For comparison purposes, home electric outlets in the United States are roughly 120 volts, with double that going to large appliances. As Milgram's experiment progressed, the learner victim would verbally complain at 120 volts and demand to be released from the experiment at 150 volts. At 285 volts, he let out an agonized scream. At 300 volts, the learner victim would refuse to answer any further questions, and after 330 volts, the shocks would not even produce grunts or groans, only ominous silence. 39 psychiatrists who reviewed the experimental procedure beforehand predicted that just over 1 in 1,000 subjects would be willing to go all the way up to the final 450-volt switch marked XXX. What Milgram actually found, however, was that when persistently instructed to do so by an authority figure in a lab coat, 65% of men and women were willing to administer successively stronger electric shocks to a screaming, pleading victim strapped into a chair begging to be let out, not only going all the way up to 450 volts, but adding 2 additional 450-volt shocks for good measure before the lab-coated experimenter declared the procedure completed. The only things faked were the shocks and harm to the victim. So, what escalating sequence of prods from an authority figure could possibly be compelling enough in the moment that 65% of people were willing to administer shocks to a begging, pleading victim, going all the way up to 450 volts long after the subject had gone silent and presumably lost consciousness? Prod 1. Please continue, or please go on. Prod 2. The experiment requires that you continue. Prod 3. It is absolutely essential that you continue. Prod 4. You have no other choice. You must go on. No imprecations, no threats of job loss, jail time, or reputational harm, just persistent instructions to administer the tests and shocks, coupled with reassurance that the subject would suffer no permanent tissue damage and assertions that the authority figure accepted full responsibility for the subject's actions. The experimenter's tone was firm but not impolite, and if the subject still refused after the fourth prod, the experiment was terminated and the subject was immediately debriefed. Were the subjects gleeful as they flipped each switch to shock the learner after he started to demand to quit at 150 volts? Not at all. While some completed the whole sequence mechanically or with minimal signs of distress, a greater number protested vehemently. They looked sad. They shook with tension. They laughed nervously. They expressed concern for the victim. Some balled their fists, and one made a half-hearted offer to trade places with the learner. Yet they still complied and administered the shocks up to 450 volts with two more 450-volt shocks for good measure. When subjects could dimly see their learner victim writhing from the shocks, they often averted their eyes. Compliance decreased in variance where the subjects were in closer proximity to the victim of their shocks, but remained substantial. In one variant where the subject was within reach of the strapped-down victim and had to force the victim's hand onto a metal plate in order to administer the shock, over 1/4 still obeyed to the very end. Later researchers, who had misgivings about the accuracy and implications of Milgram's findings, wanted to see what would happen if the victim was authentic. Their experiments with a group of college students not only verified Milgram's findings, but, as Philip Zimbardo later wrote, they illustrated how powerful the obedience effect can be when legitimate authorities exercise their power within their power domains. In these new experiments, a cute fluffy puppy was substituted for the hidden learner victim in Milgram's experiments. The cute puppy was kept on an electrified floor and could be clearly seen responding to very real electric shocks. Subjects were student volunteers being guided by a course instructor. The students were offered course credit for participating, but before the experiment began, they were informed that, by the mere act of showing up for the experiment, they had fulfilled their course credit requirement for participation in experiments. Thus, course credit was not contingent on shocking the puppy. Though the actual intensities of the shocks were much lower than labeled, the final 10 shocks were all 800 volts at 1 milliamp of current, and every switch flipped clearly caused muscle spasms and increasing pain to the helpless puppy. The puppy could only howl, squeal, run, and jump in futile attempts to escape the electrified grid. As in Milgram's experiments, the same sequence of verbal prods was used, and the experiment was immediately ended and the subject debriefed after refusing the fourth prod. Despite being clearly able to see the pain they were inflicting, 54% of male subjects and 100% of female subjects still went through the entire sequence of shocks up to the maximum voltage. The authors had no choice but to conclude that their findings were in consonance with the view that Milgram's findings may correctly be taken at face value. Milgram's findings have proven remarkably robust in the face of a variety of procedural variations. As with Milgram's subjects, inflicting such pain on a helpless victim clearly distressed the students. Some of the girls even broke down crying, but they still ran the hurting puppy through the entire sequence of shocks. Additionally, this puppy shocking experiment was designed to allow two different ways to disobey. Subjects could directly refuse the experimenter's orders, but they could also deceive the experimenter by saying that the puppy had solved the problem correctly, and so did not need to be shocked. Half the boys who refused to obey chose this alternative method over direct confrontation. As a side note, Milgram's own experiments found comparable male and female obedience rates, though the puppy shock study authors also reported personal correspondence with another professor whose unpublished Milgram-type study using adolescent girls found virtually identical 100% obedience. Two possible explanations for these differences in experimental outcomes are the ages of the subjects involved and the nature of the learner victim as a puppy instead of a human. Milgram's male and female subjects were fully mature, whereas the female subjects in the follow-up studies were adolescents and early college students, i.e., teenagers. Alternatively, as Dr. Zimbardo points out in The Lucifer Effect, the typical finding with human victims, including Milgram's own findings, is that there are no male-female gender differences in obedience. Dr. Philip Zimbardo was a close contemporary of Stanley Milgram. They actually went to high school together. Dr. Zimbardo's own most famous study, the Stanford Prison Experiment, produced results so extreme that it was terminated early, and future iterations were banned. Dr. Zimbardo's fascinating account of the experiment, as well as a deep dive into the implications and applications of the behavioral principles at play, are contained in his book The Lucifer Effect, Understanding How Good People Turn Evil. His book is essential reading for anyone who wants to psychologically inoculate themselves against subtle or overt situational factors influencing them to do things they later regret. The goal of the Stanford Prison Experiment was to use simulated prison conditions to gain insight into the psychology of imprisonment and the extent to which situational and systemic forces and social rules influence individuals' beliefs and actions. As Dr. Zimbardo put it, our research will attempt to differentiate between what people bring into a prison situation from what the situation brings out in the people who are there. Normal, healthy, intelligent, well-adjusted college students were randomly assigned to the roles of guard or prisoner. Every participant went into the experiment with the conscious knowledge that they were play acting, that the experiment was only 2 weeks long, and that they could quit at any time. All that subjects had to do to get out of the experiment was to verbally assert their right to stop participating. In his book, Dr. Zimbardo narrates how he briefed guard participants on what they could and could not do when performing their roles in this experiment. There were limits to what could be accomplished in an experiment using only a mock prison. The prisoners knew they were being imprisoned for only the relatively short time of 2 weeks, unlike the long years most real inmates serve. They also knew that there were limits to what we could do to them in an experimental setting, unlike real prisons, where prisoners can be beaten, electrically shocked, gang raped, and sometimes even killed. I made it clear that we couldn't physically abuse the prisoners in any way. I also made it evident that, despite these constraints, we wanted to create a psychological atmosphere that would capture some of the essential features characteristic of many prisons I had learned about recently. We cannot physically abuse or torture them, I said. We can create boredom. We can create a sense of frustration. We can create fear in them to some degree. We can create a notion of the arbitrariness that governs their lives, which are totally controlled by us, by the system, by you, me, Jaffe. They'll have no privacy at all. There will be constant surveillance. Nothing they do will go unobserved. They will have no freedom of action. They will be able to do nothing and say nothing that we don't permit. We're going to take away their individuality in various ways. They're going to be wearing uniforms, and at no time will anybody call them by name. They will have numbers and be called only by their numbers. In general, what all this should create in them is a sense of powerlessness. We have total power in the situation. They have none. The research question is, what will they do to try to gain power, to regain some degree of individuality, to gain some freedom, to gain some privacy? Will the prisoners essentially work against us to regain some of what they now have as they freely move outside the prison? I indicated to these neophyte guards that the prisoners were likely to think of this all as fun and games, but it was up to all of us as prison staff to produce the required psychological state in the prisoners for as long as the study lasted. We would have to make them feel as though they were in prison. We should never mention this as a study or an experiment. My initial interest was more in the prisoners and their adjustment to this prison-like situation than it was in the guards. The guards were merely ensemble players who would help create a mindset in the prisoners of the feeling of being imprisoned. Dr. Zimbardo and everyone else got more than they bargained for as reality and illusion rapidly became indistinguishable. Within less than a week, everyone had so internalized their assigned roles that the guards, especially those on the night shift, were engaging in every prisoner abuse and humiliation they could think of which didn't violate the letter of the rules from higher-ups. This included, but was not limited to, forced push-ups, sleep disruption and deprivation, control of toilet use, collective punishments imposed for the purpose of turning prisoners against their fellows who would not obey, and even stripping prisoners naked for tearing the ID numbers off the front of their prisoner uniforms. The prisoners, for their part, were responding so authentically that they often seemed to have completely forgotten they had the ability to quit. Although part of their refusal to quit may have been because doing so would have made them see themselves as weak or quitters, a turning point was reached when one prisoner falsely asserted that no one was allowed to quit. In the atmosphere created by the experiment, this claim was so plausible that it affected all the others dramatically. One prisoner, Glenn, reported afterwards, "The actual belief that we are really prisoners was real. One couldn't escape without truly drastic action followed by a series of unknown consequences." Another student prisoner even became something of a snitch in order to get improved treatment. The Stanford prison experiment demonstrated, under relatively controlled conditions, what many students of history, including America's founding fathers, already knew from painful experience. Even normal and good people will rapidly begin to abuse power under the right conditions. It also demonstrated the difficulty of predicting ahead of time how any given person will act in such situations. One of the most humble and introspective Stanford prison experiment prisoner participants articulated this in a later televised interview when challenged by the most abusive guard, who asked, "Well, you in that position, what would you have done?" The former prisoner responded, slowly and carefully, "I don't know. I can't tell you that I know what I'd do." Even such a founding luminary of the American Revolution as John Adams was not immune to these forces. In 1798, he signed the Alien and Sedition Acts passed by Congress in direct violation of the First Amendment. In his correspondence with Thomas Jefferson nearly 20 years later, Adams, perhaps thinking back to this or other episodes, soberly reflected, "Power always thinks it has a great soul and vast views beyond the comprehension of the weak, and that it is doing God's service when it is violating all his laws." The revelatory thing about Ashe's, Milgram's, and Zimbardo's experiments is that they involve ordinary people like you and I. They dispel the notion that some uniquely pathological personality is a required ingredient for evil. Milgram himself exhibited no doubt about the implications of his work. In a 1979 interview for CBS News 60 Minutes, he stated, "If a system of death camps were set up in the United States of the sort we had seen in Nazi Germany, one would be able to find sufficient personnel for these camps in any medium-sized American town." From 2020 onward, with the exception of a few imperfect havens like Sweden, South Dakota, and Florida, our worldwide experiences with face masks and the COVID-19 response in general exist in the zone where Solomon Asche's, Stanley Milgram's, and Philip Zimbardo's findings overlapped and amplified one another. In the context of COVID, masks effectively turned wearers into actor accomplices in a Solomon Asch compliance experiment. Mandates and the involvement of doctors exacerbated the impact by incorporating the influence of authority figures on obedience as described in Stanley Milgram's work. When petty authorities at every level found most people complying, many doing so enthusiastically, and their superiors either standing back or endorsing their actions, the processes for the abuse of power described by Philip Zimbardo went into overdrive. The COVID crisis response in general, and compulsory masking and vaccination in particular, were in effect a series of nationwide, uninformed, non-consensual experiments, with vicious, often at least temporarily successful attempts to virtually eliminate any kind of control group. I was just one of many who independently recognized this. In January 2021, a Voltaire-caliber online wit with the Twitter handle El Gato Malo, the bad cat, provided what is probably the most succinct summary to date, accompanied by a helpful Venn diagram. Asch showed us that people ignore their own perceptions to fit into a group. Milgram showed us that people will do things they know to be wrong if pressured by authority figures. Stanford showed us how badly people handle power, especially if egged on. COVID validated them all. 2 days after posting this remark, El Gato Malo was decatformed, and banned from Twitter. People are not wired simply to recognize and conform to existing social trends, but also to recognize and adopt emerging social trends. As Robert Cialdini put it, researchers have identified a consequential quirk in human perception. When we notice a change, we expect the change will likely continue in the same direction when it appears as a trend. This simple presumption has fueled every financial investment bull market and real estate bubble on record. Before mask panic set in, and authorities in most areas made masks mandatory, only a small minority of people who met two predisposing conditions were putting on masks. These people, 1, believed that masks worked, and 2, feared SARS-CoV-2 more than they feared standing out from the group. They were a minority that has always existed, and whom most of us regarded as aberrations to be pitied rather than taken seriously. especially as early proclamations by public health and other authority figures initially ran counter to wearing masks. However, as fear and uncertainty regarding the virus increased, so did the number of those wearing masks. The snowball started rolling downhill. Key takeaways. Stanley Milgram and his successors' experiments showed that most people will go farther in obedience to authority than most people realize, including inflicting direct harm on innocent third parties simply because an authority figure insists that they do so. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment showed how quickly people can slip into roles defined for them, turning even illusory roles into reality, and how prone even normal people are to abuse power and authority under the right circumstances. Masks were an essential and highly effective prop for getting people to internalize their new subordinate, good citizen in a pandemic roles during the COVID crisis. This, in turn, enhanced compliance with all COVID-related directives issued by authorities, who more often than not followed the same behavioral patterns as the abusive guards in the Stanford prison experiment. Engineering an avalanche. I am afraid, and therefore unquestioningly obedient. Václav Havel. Expanding on Ash's work, Cialdini describes three conditions that maximize social proof's persuasive force. When we are unsure of what is best to do, uncertainty; when the evidence of what is best to do comes from numerous others, the many; and when that evidence comes from people like us, similarity. All of these converged in masking for COVID. As with Ash's experimental majority, the more the minority consensus in favor of masking grew, the more seriously we took it. Fear and uncertainty about the risk from SARS-CoV-2 and its transmission became nearly universal. Many others, like ourselves, were modeling mask wearing, and this number increased daily, creating its own strong social proof that was only heightened when many authority figures like doctors and other healthcare providers began masking up as well, especially when they went to greater extremes by adding further accoutrements like goggles and a face shield. More people began to wear masks, generating yet more fear, more social proof, and more validation for those already wearing masks. The psychological avalanche acquired a self-perpetuating, self-enhancing critical mass almost overnight. As if all this was not enough, many public health officials, politicians, and news sources engaged in deliberate efforts and messaging designed to heighten fear still further. Social psychologists have spent the last century meticulously studying the influence of individual and group behavior on belief. Internal governmental reports about COVID-related public health measures show that working knowledge gained from the last century of behavioral studies was consciously applied to the public. For example, in an October 2020 report, the United Kingdom's Scientific Pandemic Insights Group on Behaviors advised that in order to increase young people's compliance with COVID-19 preventative behaviors, communications should draw upon social norms of effective adherence by emphasizing what other peers are doing, descriptive, e.g., your peers are switching to socializing online, and approved perceptions of behaviors, injunctive, e.g., your peers think you should start socializing online. Communications targeting young people should, where possible, be delivered by trusted non-governmental sources, e.g., charities, celebrities, sports clubs, commercial brands. A 17-page German Department of the Interior Bundesinnenministerium paper leaked in March 2020 recommended that the government should intentionally increase the population's fear of SARS-CoV-2. The paper endorsed three specific strategies for doing this. 1. Stress the breathing problems of COVID-19 patients to deliberately trigger primal fears of death by suffocation. 2. Terrify and guilt children by persuading them that they are responsible for whether or not one of their parents or grandparents catches COVID and dies in agony. And 3. Emphasize the unknown long-term health effects caused by SARS-CoV-2 infection, including the theoretical possibility of sudden death or irreversible damage, then let people's imaginations run wild filling in the blanks. One straightforward and overt use of behavioral rules of influence to push masks involved the rule of liking. The rule of liking states that people we like influence our behavior. Many people like celebrities. Put these two facts together in 2020 and you get celebrities and influencers across the globe modeling face masks. In one representative example from July 2020, a 30-second advertisement from the Alliance for Aging Research included masked pictures of everyday individuals, people in scrubs, and actresses like Jennifer Aniston, Natalie Portman, and Gal Gadot, alongside pictures of Republican and Democrat politicians, including both Donald Trump and Joe Biden, wearing masks. Celebrity monologues castigating people who refused to wear masks were given plenty of airtime. Once we started putting on masks, a more subtle interior effect began to play out. Compulsory masking hijacked an ongoing process at work in every one of us throughout our lives, often at an unconscious level. We all know intuitively that our behavior and beliefs affect each other. We try to behave according to our beliefs, and when we consistently behave in a certain way, we find that our beliefs support those behaviors. The aphorism, "fake it till you make it," refers to our conscious efforts to steer this process, usually against our in-the-moment preferences. Dr. Zimbardo comments, "Get people to perform good actions, and they will generate the necessary underlying principles to justify them." Talmudic scholars are supposed to have preached not to require that people believe before they pray, only to do what is needed to get them to begin to pray. Then they will come to believe in what and to whom they are praying. This underlying mechanic is part of being human. It is neither inherently good nor bad, and can work in either direction guided by our conscious choices. This dynamic also predicts that the simple act of wearing a mask makes people more likely to believe they should wear a mask. As it turns out, we have good evidence from nothing less than a randomized, controlled trial demonstrating that this is indeed how mask wearing influenced our beliefs in practice. The Danish face mask study by Bundgaard et al. Did not just look at the impact of mask wearing on viral transmission rates. It also examined the impact of mask wearing on people's beliefs about whether they should wear masks. As we saw when we looked at the Danish face mask study in Part 1, the two study cohorts, masked and non-masked, were carefully randomized at the start, so there is no reason to assume a lopsided distribution of beliefs regarding mask wearing going into it. At the end of the study, however, participant exit polling revealed a remarkable thing. Despite the ongoing marketing blitz for masking, just 21% of the control group that had not worn masks favored the use of face masks for future epidemics, and fully half of the control group said that masks should not be used for future epidemics. Among the group that had routinely worn face masks for 2 months, however, the proportion of people who believed that masks should not be used for future epidemics dropped from 1/2 to 1/3, and the portion who said that face masks should be used for future epidemics nearly doubled, going from 21% to 37%. Both groups were exposed to the same social environment over the same time period, so this difference between the two groups cannot simply be attributed to changes in popular attitudes towards masks as 2020 progressed. This dramatic 16 to 18% shift in the study participants' beliefs about masks is greater than the popular vote margin of most presidential elections throughout America's history. No strong social pressure or pseudo-legal coercion was necessary. All it took was the mere act of wearing masks for less than 2 months. Now imagine the impact on belief for more than 2 years of routine face mask use, especially in countries where mask wearing was compulsory, social pressure to wear masks was high, and the drive for masking was magnified by pseudo-legal coercion and the use of other behavioral psychology tools. Anyone inclined to think that masks are a good idea might see these randomized controlled study results as more evidence which favors mask mandates, reasoning that if you force people to habitually do the right thing, eventually they'll do it voluntarily. Everyone inclined to value independent thought and freedom of belief, on the other hand, should find this very concerning and remain on their guard against other attempts to manipulate their belief through behavior. The mutually causal relationship between behavior and belief means that mandatory masking constituted not merely compelled symbolic speech in violation of the First Amendment, but also a brute force attempt to compel belief. If you are thinking to yourself, dear reader, that wearing masks for a couple of years did not affect your beliefs about whether you should wear masks, I sincerely hope you are right, and you may very well be part of that minority of the population of whom this is true. Unfortunately, that is demonstrably untrue when applied to the population as a whole. The more people wear masks, the more they believe they should be wearing masks. Key takeaways. The power of social influence is maximized in situations when we see many people like us doing the same thing, especially when we are individually uncertain about what we ought to do. Fear and behavioral psychology were deliberately exploited to get people to wear masks and conform to other COVID crisis measures. Because behavior and belief influence each other, the mere act of wearing masks for an extended period of time had a dramatic impact on people's beliefs about whether they should wear masks. The slippery slope is not always a fallacy. Behaviorally, mask wearing was a highly effective foot in the door that opened wearers to complying with greater impositions down the road. The classic experiment looking at this mechanic of human nature was done in 1966 by Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser. Friedman and Fraser found that people who consented to putting up a 3x3-inch card promoting safe driving in the corner of one of their windows subsequently became more than twice as likely to consent to having a large, obnoxious safe driving billboard erected in their front yard. Fewer than 20% of those in the control group who were not psychologically primed by putting up a 3x3-inch card in their window agreed to put the large sign on their lawn, compared to over 55% of the experimental subjects. Friedman and Fraser's study is justly famous. In his own work on behavioral psychology, Robert Cialdini dwells on some of the implications. Friedman and Fraser's findings tell us to be very careful about agreeing to trivial requests because that agreement can influence our self-concepts. Such an agreement can not only increase our compliance with very similar, much larger requests, but also make us more willing to perform a variety of larger favors that are only remotely connected to the little favor we did earlier. It's this second kind of influence concealed within small commitments that scares me. It scares me enough that I am rarely willing to sign a petition anymore, even for a position I support. The action has the potential to influence not only my future behavior, but also my self-image in ways I may not want. Further, once a person's self-image is altered, all sorts of subtle advantages become available to someone who wants to exploit the new image. Once people have been induced to take actions that shift their self-images to that of, let's say, public-spirited citizens, they are likely to be public-spirited in a variety of other circumstances where their compliance may also be desired, and they are likely to continue their public-spirited behavior for as long as their new self-images hold. Don't be selfish. Be a good person. Be a good citizen. Care about others. Be part of the solution. Put on a mask. Sound familiar? Cialdini also describes how basic tools of psychology like the foot in the door and gradual successive steps were used on Americans captured during the Korean War to get almost all of them to collaborate with their Chinese captors in one way or another. The most skilled of the interrogators started with small, innocuous, eminently reasonable and truthful concessions, such as simply getting the POWs to agree that the United States is not perfect. Once the minor concession had been made, more substantive ones were pushed, until a prisoner might find himself describing a problem with America in writing. Once he put something in writing, why not sign it? After all, if it weren't true, you wouldn't have written it. If you're not willing to criticize your country, how about criticizing yourself? You wouldn't be a prisoner if you hadn't done something wrong, even if only an honest mistake. Confession and self-criticism are marks of humility, after all, and humility is a virtue. Of course, any written statements could then be used as tangible evidence to help persuade other prisoners to greater cooperation, or to help get the author to internalize the label of collaborator, leading to even more extensive acts of collaboration. Essays by these new collaborators could produce an even greater return on investment by being recorded and broadcast. The point is that the slippery slope fallacy is not always a fallacy, and even seemingly reasonable concessions are sometimes better rejected even if refusal seems irrational at first glance. In Stanley Milgram's experiments, each new shock was just 15 volts higher than the previous one. Progressing in gradual successive steps, just a little bit more, is number 7 on Philip Zimbardo's list of 10 lessons from the Milgram studies on how to get good people to do evil things. The more innocuous each increment, the harder it becomes to spot the process as a whole from within. Dr. Zimbardo describes how gradual escalation of abuses from minimal to extreme occurred at Abu Ghraib, culminating in the infamous and justly condemned night shift abuses. Dr. Zimbardo also describes how conformity and socialized obedience to authority, two integral characteristics of compulsory masking and the COVID response in general, were foundational elements in building that abusive environment. In light of all this, consider a short 2002 article published in the British Medical Journal. It describes how prisoners held without trial in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, were forced to wear surgical masks, earmuffs, and blindfolds for extended periods of time as part of a degrading standardized procedure designed to make them more psychologically submissive. Like the interplay between behavior and belief, the ability of even small acts to shift a person's self-image or self-concept is not inherently bad. We each have the individual ability to determine whether a foot in the door followed by gradual successive steps leads us downwards or upwards, depending on which trivial requests we choose to comply with. A conscious, intentional awareness of how this process works can alert us so that we do not blindly follow any given set of railroad tracks laid out for us by others who may not have our best interests in mind. Our free will permits us to intentionally choose to continue taking steps along a gradually ascending path, doing the right thing when fear, discouragement, or social pressure would otherwise stop us. It also permits us to arrest and reverse a downward slide that, to all appearances, seems inexorable. In his discussion of this process, Dr. Zimbardo envisions a slow ascent into goodness, step by step, as a kind of reverse Milgram progression. By implication, enlightened moral authority figures could help direct this process. There is, however, one major vulnerability that was on full display during the response to COVID. Any reverse Milgram authority figures assisting progress into goodness will be just as vulnerable to behavioral psychology and irrationality, sometimes more so, than the people they seek to lead. Along with many other episodes of history, the COVID crisis provided another working example of how and why outsourcing our moral judgments to ostensibly beneficent authorities, especially distant politicians with no personal knowledge of our individual situations, creates more risk and harm than any natural hazard, viral or otherwise. Key takeaways. The use of gradual successive steps to reach a particular end state is a powerful behavioral psychology tool that can be used on an individual or societal level for good or ill. This is especially true of small acts that make subtle changes to how we see ourselves, our internal self-concepts. Compulsory masking was a step that seemed minor and justifiable to most people, but which actually had major import and paved the way for greater acts of compliance down the road. We need to be vigilant about where small concessions we make can lead, consciously define our personal boundaries ahead of time, and resist any changes that move us towards a destination we do not want to reach. In particular, we must avoid outsourcing our moral judgments. Sheeple and science deniers. Another basic compliance technique used to maximum effect and with zero subtlety in support of masking throughout the COVID crisis was the use of labeling and altercasting. Altercasting is a persuasion or compliance technique within the broader labeling theory of behavior, whereby people take on the characteristics they are described as having, whether good or bad. When you altercast, you describe someone as possessing characteristics you want them to display. Want someone to be more cooperative? Compliment them on how well they work with others. Want a child to pick up after themselves? Let them know that their teacher complimented how neat and organized they are compared to the other children. Want to help someone with their diet? Praise them as having behaved characteristically when they exhibit self-discipline in exercise or food choices. In other words, give people a label you want them to live up to. Dr. Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment illustrates how powerful labeling and altercasting can be, even in an experimental setting where everyone knows at some level that they are play actors getting paid for the roles they have been assigned. Dr. Zimbardo explains, our sense of identity is in large measure conferred on us by others in the ways they treat or mistreat us, recognize or ignore us, praise us or punish us. Some people make us timid and shy. Others elicit our sex appeal and dominance. In some groups, we are made leaders, while in others, we are reduced to being followers. We come to live up to or down to the expectations others have of us. The expectations of others often become self-fulfilling prophecies. Without realizing it, we often behave in ways that confirm the beliefs others have about us. Those subjective beliefs can create new realities for us. We often become who other people think we are, in their eyes and in our behavior. Give someone an identity label of the kind that you would like them to have as someone who will then do the action you want to elicit from them. When you tell a person that he or she is helpful, altruistic, and kind, that person is more likely to do helpful, altruistic, and kind behaviors for others. Dr. Cialdini lists still more examples. What those around us think is true of us importantly determines what we ourselves think. For example, one study found that a week after hearing they were considered charitable people by their neighbors, people gave much more money to a canvasser from the Multiple Sclerosis Association. Apparently, the mere knowledge that others viewed them as charitable caused the individuals to make their actions congruent with that view. Admittedly, there are some caveats. The label has to have some plausible relationship to reality, and it works best if the person sees that trait or characteristic as being desirable. Even better if it's already part of their self-concept or if you can get people to label themselves. At its best, sincere altercasting reinforces and enhances good attributes people already possess or are striving to develop. In another application of the technique inhabiting more of a moral gray zone, Dr. Cialdini describes how life insurance agents make profitable use of altercasting by highlighting parents' role as protectors to make them more willing to purchase life insurance for their families. At the opposite extreme, negative labels can produce the opposite effect if the targets internalize them. "You're such a troublemaker," or "you don't care about anyone other than yourself," can turn into self-fulfilling prophecies through labeling and altercasting. A great deal of self-help literature is devoted to helping people remove the self-fulfilling negative labels they carry internally. Mask wearing was a classic case of altercasting good citizenship. For COVID, the roles of protector, good person, and good citizen were effectively altercast onto virtually everyone in society, with detailed instructions about the performance expected of those roles, including wearing a mask. This provided an artificial island of certainty in a sea of uncertainty and fear, with predictable results on compliance. Masks became symbolic self-labeling of helpfulness. Once bestowed, these positive labels could later be threatened and publicly withdrawn from any who refused to wear masks or get vaccinated, creating yet another disincentive to push back on the pervading narrative. Conversely, those who maintained their autonomy and refused to wear masks were regularly vilified, labeled as inexcusably selfish at best, and deliberately committing negligent homicide at worst. Mask noncompliance, no matter how little of it there was, became an easy scapegoat when scary COVID numbers went up, whereas declines in COVID cases coinciding with mask mandates were endlessly hyped as proof that masks work. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore because of this. Scorn and frustration embodied in negative labels like brainless, selfish, childish, and science denier were flung at resistors, who responded in kind to the cowards, sheeple, and branch Covidians. In his book, Dr. Zimbardo describes what happened in variants of Milgram-style shock experiments where different labels were applied to the victims. Those labeled in a more dehumanizing way as animals were shocked most intensively, and their shock level increased linearly over 10 trials. It also climbed higher and higher over trials, up to an average of 7 out of the maximum of 10 for each group of participants. Those labeled nice were given the smallest amount of shock, while the unlabeled neutral group fell in the middle of these two extremes. The more effectively a role is played, the more powerful and immersive its effect becomes, potentially to the point where idea and reality merge. Bringing these two things closer together is, after all, part of the goal of altercasting in the first place. During the Stanford prison experiment, a visit from an actual prison chaplain dramatically increased the sense of authenticity for the participants. Dr. Zimbardo described how the priest's effective role-playing deepened the illusion of the experiment, which was already nearly off the rails by that point. The priest's visit highlights the growing confusion here between reality and illusion, between role-playing and self-determined identity. He is a real priest in the real world with personal experience in real prisons, and although he is fully aware that ours is a mock prison, he so fully and deeply enacts his assumed role that he helps to transform our show into reality. With compulsory masking, whole populations were press-ganged into exactly this kind of highly immersive mutual role-playing, blurring the lines between pandemic illusion and viral reality until the two were virtually indistinguishable. Like the priest in Dr. Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, the performance of healthcare workers in wearing masks and adhering to other COVID-related displays had an especially potent immersive effect. Healthcare providers' portrayal of anything related to health and disease is especially credible because of their perceived expertise, but people with healthcare degrees are, on the whole, no less vulnerable to behavioral psychology than anyone else. Personally, I believe many are even more vulnerable than average because of habits they had to form in order to successfully progress through the many-layered medical training process and a hierarchy which rewards things like unquestioning deference to experts. A lot of people with healthcare or public health degrees who had less special knowledge about masks than most painters or industrial workers suddenly found themselves altercast on a grand scale by the media or on an intimate scale by friends and family as experts on all things related to infection control, including masks. This segues into how the even more powerful behavioral psychology rule of commitment and consistency was harnessed to fuel and perpetuate mask wearing, because healthcare workers of all kinds locked themselves into positions on masks by engaging in very public displays of mask use or outright endorsements, which gradually escalated. Once they did this, the psychological rule of commitment and consistency immediately took hold like a mental straitjacket. Key takeaways. How we see ourselves and how we act based on that self-concept are influenced by the roles and labels that other people assign to us. Widespread labeling and altercasting were used to enhance compliance with mask wearing. As illustrated in the Stanford prison experiment, playing even artificial roles can effectively merge illusion and reality. When a real-life role is incorporated into this process, as was the case with the prison chaplain recruited by Dr. Zimbardo to assist the Stanford prison experiment, and with healthcare workers wearing masks, the effect is greatly magnified. The matrix creates its own glitch. Generally, good personal consistency is a healthy, desirable, and even vital trait. Consistency is an essential precondition for logic and rationality, and we all think highly of people who consistently adhere to their principles, especially in situations where doing so involves a high personal cost. Hypocrisy, on the other hand, is by definition inconsistency between one's professed beliefs and one's behavior. Internal inconsistencies and contradictions within a story help us detect false statements and better get at the truth. It is natural and usually beneficial that, as Cialdini puts it, once we make a choice or take a stand, we encounter personal and interpersonal pressures to think and behave consistently with that commitment. Much of this pressure stems from the self-image we create or reinforce by our actions, but the binding internal strength of some commitments is greater because they tap into our self-image more effectively than others. Commitments become strongest when they are active, public, effortful, and freely chosen. Mask wearing meets the first 3 out of 4 of these criteria for everyone, but fulfilled all 4 in the case of everyone who put on a mask voluntarily. Wearing a mask is an affirmative act, highly visible, takes effort, and was embraced wholeheartedly by a substantial portion of the population. When it comes to mask wearing, there is no middle ground or way to conceal your symbolic speech or your public stance that accompanies it. You either wear a mask or you don't. The public nature of mask wearing made the consistency principle even more powerful than it would be otherwise, especially for those who started wearing masks prior to the mandates out of genuine belief or instinctive concession to simple social pressure. Because of how visible it is, mask wearing and non-wearing cannot help be not just a symbolic public statement, but also a public commitment. Public commitments of this type are the most difficult and painful to reverse. As Cialdini says, it's hardly surprising that people try to avoid the look of inconsistency. For appearance's sake, the more public a stand, the more reluctant we are to change it. When choices and commitments are made publicly, the power of the internal drive for consistency is multiplied. Consequently, public commitments are the most likely to be lasting commitments. Many individual public commitments to masking will never be reversed, at least not explicitly. There is at least one way, however, in which the zeal for mask wearing that culminated in overt propaganda and widespread mandates created its own Achilles heel and helped to loosen the mental vice grip of the masking mentality even as outward compliance increased. In order to maintain a behavior in the absence of oversight and external pressure, a person needs to have internalized that behavior and incorporated the reason for it into their self-image. As Robert Cialdini points out, the less detectable outside pressure such a reason contains, the better. In other words, for behaviors like mask wearing to really stick, people need to engage in them as voluntarily as possible, or at least believe they are doing so. The more overt and detectable the external pressures and incentives applied to induce a behavior become, the less likely people are to internalize the behavior. When the visible group consensus endorsing masks was supported by mandates with a credible, eagerly exercised threat of force, the pressure to conform went off the scale. The quarter of the population who Ash's experiments predict would have been able to resist the simple passive influence of seeing everyone else wearing masks was reduced to less than 1 in 100 in many places. The stronger the pressure got, however, the more visible and noticeable it became, and the less internal commitment practitioners needed. On their own, excesses and extremes have a tendency to make individuals pause and reevaluate what is going on. Mask mandates and other highly coercive measures like denying essential services, including medical care, to the unmasked certainly were excessive and extreme. But another major psychological exit ramp this created was more subtle. The draconian mandates and penalties provided everyone wearing a mask with a very plausible and sensible reason for their mask wearing, a reason which did not warp their self-concept into one that would keep them wearing masks when the mandates were lifted. The self-concept, "I wear a mask to stay out of trouble," is perfectly compatible with other self-concept beliefs such as, "I do not believe masks work," and "wearing a mask does not make me a better person." It can also slowly and quietly supplant other beliefs that would lead a person to continue wearing a mask, such as mistaken beliefs about the proven effectiveness or moral necessity of mask wearing. For a large fraction of the population, the forceful imposition of mask mandates provided an obvious explanation for their mask wearing that helped them avoid internally committing to the practice. Because it was clear, or at least plausible, to themselves and others that they had not made a public commitment to mask wearing so much as done so to stay out of trouble, this critical segment of the population remained open to taking off their masks. The coercion and control used to push masks were so overt and forceful that even people who were genuinely committed to mask wearing at some point were able to ascribe their behavior to external pressure rather than causes which might threaten their self-image. When the direction of social pressure to conform finally shifted and masks were no longer being pushed, the coercive methods used to push masks provided people with a built-in face-saving excuse for changing their habits. Despite this hidden silver lining side effect of the coercive methods used to push masks, the behavioral forces of commitment and consistency impelling people to wear masks were often overwhelming. Social media campaigns with convenient profile picture templates and frames like the #IWearAMaskBecause campaign were another stroke of psychological Machiavellianism. By inducing people to not only make a public commitment to wearing a mask, but also to commit to their reasons for wearing a mask, campaigns like this got participants to embrace personal responsibility for wearing their masks, thus internalizing the behavior and the underlying mentality. Some of the most public mask advocates who cannot scrub their personal histories or are unwilling to admit a mistake will no doubt go to their graves insisting that the mask mandates were necessary and saved thousands of lives, or that mandating masks was still the right thing to do even if they had no medical benefits. As Cialdini explains, our innate compulsion for consistency is what drives this behavior, but it can easily go from being an asset to a vulnerability. Sometimes it is not the effort of hard cognitive work that makes us shirk thoughtful activity, but the harsh consequences of that activity. Sometimes it is the cursedly clear and unwelcome set of answers provided by straight thinking that makes us mental slackers. There are certain disturbing things we simply would rather not realize. Because it is a pre-programmed and mindless method of responding, automatic consistency can supply a safe hiding place from troubling realizations. Sealed within the fortress walls of rigid consistency, we can be impervious to the sieges of reason. Although consistency is generally good, even vital, there is a foolish, rigid variety to be shunned. We need to be wary of the tendency to be automatically and unthinkingly consistent, for it lays us open to the maneuvers of those who want to exploit the mechanical commitment and consistency sequence for profit. The bottom line is this. Consistency must always remain a secondary value at most. The moment we give consistency precedence over a primary value like truth, it mutates from a virtue and asset into a fault and liability. Self-awareness and a personal commitment to truth as the superseding value serve as the most effective defense against having our default impulse to remain consistent used against us, as it was turned against so many of us in the case of masking. Key takeaways. People's natural impulse to maintain internal and external consistency was taken advantage of to drive masking by getting people to publicly commit to their support for the practice and to their reasons for wearing masks. The heavy-handed coercion and pressure used to push masking created a psychological escape route for many people by giving them a reason to wear masks that allowed them to stop wearing masks without feeling inconsistent or threatening their self-image. Consistency must remain a secondary value, subordinate to higher primary values like truth. The rule of reciprocation. The sheer number and power of behavioral psychology rules and principles deployed to get people to wear masks has been so great that it is practically impossible to pick out any single one for the title of most effective. That being said, if I personally had to put down money on the issue, I would give serious consideration to the rule of reciprocation for the top spot. This hardwired psychological rule simply states, we should provide to others the kind of actions they have provided us. While most of us feel gratitude at a gift, we also experience great discomfort if we are unable to reciprocate or repay in kind. To get rid of the resulting feeling of discomfort, we may even wind up repaying several times over to eliminate any hint of indebtedness. This usually unconscious psychological rule can enforce even uninvited debts because our sense of obligation to repay does not require that we asked for the gifts or favors. The Japanese have a specific term for favors like this, which connotes the discomfort and trouble they cause for the recipient. Arigata mewaku, meaning an unwanted favor or unwelcome kindness. Robert Glover, a psychologist specializing in relationships, describes the dysfunctional dynamic that arises when people misuse the rule of reciprocation, especially in romantic or intimate relationships. People can create covert contracts using unwanted or unsolicited favors as an indirect attempt to get needs met. In other words, giving primarily in order to get. This strategy sometimes works in the short run, but in the long run, resentment tends to build on both sides of the relationship. The giving partner does not get their needs met reliably because they are rarely communicated clearly. At the same time, the recipient partner develops a feeling of emotional indebtedness and comes to resent being involuntarily put in that position, especially because the terms of the contract are rarely clear even to the giving partner. As psychologists Henry Cloud and Robert Townsend put it in their best-selling book Boundaries, When to Say Yes, How to Say No, caring for someone so they'll care back for us is simply an indirect means of controlling someone else. If you've ever been on the receiving end of that kind of maneuver, you'll understand. One minute you've taken the compliment or favor, the next minute you've hurt someone's feelings by not figuring out the price tag attached. While reciprocal exchange in loving relationships is a profound source of joy, and even unwanted favors are usually well-intentioned, unscrupulous manipulators or compliance specialists can and do take advantage of this hardwired psychological rule of influence. During the COVID crisis, the rule of reciprocation was unscrupulously used to turn everyone's mask wearing into one giant exchange of favors. The fiendishly clever propaganda phrase, "My mask protects you, your mask protects me," was a psychological coup. Not only did it invoke the powerful social influence rule of reciprocation to drive mask wearing, it recast and promoted the society-wide application of a dysfunctional and manipulative relationship tactic as an act of virtue. The response to COVID in general, and masking in particular, recycled a dysfunctional relationship dynamic to gain compliance by turning our best motivations against us. Many people consciously understood or at least intuited that this was occurring, and very reasonably resented and resisted being forced into an abusive relationship. Meanwhile, others so fully embraced this facet of the masking mentality that when confronted with an unmasked face, they behaved like scorned lovers. Key takeaway. Humans have a hardwired need to repay favors that they receive, even unasked, unwanted favors. This rule of reciprocation was exploited to increase compliance with mask wearing through slogans like, "My mask protects you, your mask protects me." The rule of unity. We're all in this together. Not to be left out, the social influence rule of unity was also invoked directly and perpetually throughout the COVID crisis using society-wide jingoistic appeals like, "We're all in this together," and "Do your part, wear a mask." Simply put, the rule of unity is that people generally behave most favorably towards those they see as sharing an identity in common with them. This rule isn't limited to superficial physical characteristics, although those can certainly play a role, but is especially relevant to commonalities of ideology, cultural outlook, and shared experiences. Shared suffering, in particular, bonds people into we groups like nothing else does. Apart from the obvious visible categorization and symbolic communications inherent in mask wearing, the artificial but very real shared suffering that mask wearing entails created a unique sense of in-group cohesion, particularly for sincere wearers. This shared suffering naturally increased positive feelings of mask wearers towards others who were wearing masks, creating a new group identity. Unfortunately, the negative rule of unity is that people behave worst towards those they see as having an identity which is adversarial to their own. As the in-group we effect from mask wearing became stronger, resentment of those who refused to participate in the unifying form of group suffering grew proportionately, especially for those who were so affected by the propaganda campaign that they experienced visceral fear at the sight of an unmasked face. Those who refused to wear masks experienced their own corresponding version of this bonding effect with each other, centered around the social suffering, opprobrium, and ostracism inflicted on them by especially Pharisaic mask wearers and enforcing authorities. In practice, social indicators provide people with as much information about the status of an epidemic as deaths and hospitalizations do. At the close of the Philadelphia yellow fever epidemic of 1793, which was proportionately far worse than COVID, killing 10% of the city's population over the course of about 12 weeks, John Adams' son, Thomas Adams, wrote to his mother from the city to reassure her. The idea of danger is dissipated in a moment when we perceive thousands walking in perfect security about their customary business and no ill consequences ensuing from it. In the case of COVID, compulsory masking forcibly suppressed this essential social proof, enabling the sense of emergency to drag out far longer than the time it took even the Black Plague to rip through communities. Compulsory masking was like refusing to allow the defendant in a criminal case to present any exculpatory evidence. With no visible alternatives, group pressure and groupthink produced self-reinforcing mass hysteria. A 2021 article in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health on mass hysteria in the context of COVID was very direct in explaining how mass anxiety can grip a population, as well as how beneficial and essential dissenting minorities become during these times. Once anxiety has spread and the majority of a group behaves in a certain way, there is the phenomenon of conformity, i.e., social pressure makes individuals behave in the same way as other members of the group. In the end, there may be a phenomenon that has been called emergent norms. When a group establishes a norm, everyone ends up following that norm. For example, if a group decides to wear masks, everyone agrees to that norm. While anyone in a hysteria related to public health may voluntarily close their own business, wear a mask, or stay at home, in a minimal state, no one can use coercion to force others who are healthy and do not succumb to the hysteria to close their businesses, wear masks, or quarantine. A minority can just ignore the collective panic and continue to live their normal lives, because they are free to do so. Such a minority can be an example and a wake-up call to those that do succumb to the collective hysteria or are close to doing so. This minority may be especially attractive to borderline cases. Suppose that a small group of people during a collective health hysteria continues to go shopping, to work, to socialize, and breathe freely, and does not fall ill massively and fatally. Having this example, the anxiety of observers may fall. Others may follow the example, and the group of hysterics shrinks. Mask wearing naturally incorporates so many hardwired rules of influence and compliance that it serves as an extremely potent behavioral psychology device even before fear of any virus gets thrown into the mix. Many of these psychological rules were consciously or intuitively invoked and amplified to get people to internalize their mask-wearing compliance. Others were organically swept up along the way. Masking, by its very nature, maximized the mutually causal relationship between behavior and belief. For, as we know from dissonance theory, writes Dr. Zimbardo, beliefs follow behavior. Mask-wearing was a foot in the door, a seemingly small initial act, after all, it's just a mask, which primed wearers for more extreme acts of compliance down the road. The seemingly trivial nature of mask wearing was also used as a rhetorical bludgeon to browbeat those who objected into compliance. Once people started wearing masks, the behavioral psychology rules of reciprocation, unity, commitment, and consistency gave the behavior and implicit underlying ideology its own self-perpetuating positive feedback momentum. Simultaneously, the influential power of positive and negative labeling, as well as the rule of liking, were intentionally used to further increase mask-wearing compliance. Despite all this, A small, almost paradoxical measure of saving grace was that, though mask mandates maximized compliance and genuinely convinced a lot of people through simple habituation, they also helped undermine the mask-related mass psychosis by providing a psychological exit ramp for many of those people who had not completely internalized the masking mentality. Key takeaways. Humans have a natural tendency to group themselves and to favor members of their own personal subgroups over outsiders. In addition, shared suffering bonds group members more closely. Compulsory masking artificially created two new subgroups, the masked and the unmasked. The shared suffering from wearing masks, combined with official censure of non-masking, created a self-reinforcing cohesion within that part of the population who willingly wore masks. Compulsory masking also extended the COVID crisis long past its natural termination point by artificially suppressing the social proof necessary to end the crisis, unmasked individuals going about their lives without harm. Individual mask psychology. Behavior change happens mostly by speaking to people's feelings. John Cotter, author of Leading Change. Face masking has been nothing less than weaponized behavioral psychology, and even those who recognized or suspected the implications right away still found themselves conforming all too often. Masking was and remains one of the biggest psychological linchpins of what future generations will rightly see as an epoch-defining global hysteria. So far, we have investigated some specific reasons that people wear masks by looking at the empirical case for masks as an infection control tool, the communicative effect of masks, and the powerful social influences that led the majority of people to put on masks starting in 2020. Fear, altruism, and a sense of duty were deliberately exploited to gain increased compliance. But for many people, these were only part of the complex motivations involved. At an individual level, there are multiple reasons why one person dons a mask while another adamantly refuses to do so. Wearing a mask produces what Philip Zimbardo describes as a de-individuating or anonymizing effect. For individuals with social anxiety, this effect can provide a sense of comfort and protection that has nothing to do with infection control. Prior to 2020, mask addiction was recognized in Japan in at least some professional circles as a subtype of behavioral addiction or process dependency to which patients with social anxiety disorder were especially vulnerable. While the American Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, DSM-5, does not yet include behavioral addictions as a separate category, it does include some behavioral addictions like gambling disorder and internet gaming disorder under separate entries. To one degree or another, behavioral addictions are recognized in both the US and Japan, and in Japan they are generally categorized as either process addictions, e.g. gambling, internet use, shopping, etc., or addiction to human relations, e.g. sex addiction or love addiction. Japanese psychologist Yuzo Kikumoto is credited with popularizing, possibly even coining, the phrase mask dependency in his prescient 2011 book, Date Mask Addiction: People Standing at the Entrance to an Unrelated Society. Wearing a mask hides your identity and makes you feel safe, Kikumoto wrote nearly 10 years before COVID. One of his patients explained to him that hiding her face makes her feel better because she doesn't have to be seen by other people. Another said simply, "It somehow calms me down." These sentiments were mirrored during COVID in a May 2021 op-ed for the New York Daily News, with one author writing, "From the time I was a child, I worked to hide myself in public. I hunched over. I kept my eyes down, arranged my features into neutral non-entity. Making myself as invisible as possible became second nature. Then came COVID and masks. Now, poof! Courtesy of a bit of fabric, no need to worry about my expression, that I look too open, too available for interruption." There is a price to pay for this transient relief from social anxiety, however. As we saw in Part 2, a 2013 randomized controlled trial conducted in Hong Kong showed that when we wear masks, we come across as less empathetic to other people. The disconnecting effect produced by masks works on viewers as well as wearers. When doctors wear masks while talking to their patients, patients perceive them as being less empathetic. In his own work, Dr. Zimbardo emphasizes another effect of masks. In addition to the power of rules and roles, situational forces mount in power with the introduction of uniforms, costumes, and masks, all disguises of one's usual appearance that promote anonymity and reduce personal accountability. When people feel anonymous in a situation, as if no one is aware of their true identity, and thus that no one probably cares, they can more easily be induced to behave in antisocial ways. This makes one especially loathsome manipulation tactic that received wall-to-wall media support particularly ironic. In yet another transparent attempt to increase compliance using variants of labeling and altercasting, antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, was publicly and repeatedly portrayed as being linked with refusal to wear a mask or comply with other anti-COVID measures. Sociopathic traits linked to not wearing a mask or social distancing during pandemic. Study, read one typically overstated headline. Another trumpeted, refusing to wear a face mask can be a sign of serious personality disorder, docs warn. As was typical during COVID, anyone who bothered to read the study being cited would find these characterizations of the results misleading at best. The study touted by media as providing evidence of sociopathic traits in anti-maskers simply involved administering part of a personality test to 1,578 Brazilian adults, combined with 3 yes or no questions asking whether respondents thought it was necessary to engage in social distancing, hand-washing, and/or wearing a face mask to control COVID. The authors themselves were careful to avoid saying that the personality characteristics of any of their surveyed groups even deviated from the range of what is normal, much less suggest pathology. At the very least, the omission means that the numerous histrionic headlines spawned from it badly mischaracterized the study's results. Instead, they simply make much of the marginal differences in personality traits which they did find, while ignoring commonalities like the group's identical degrees of irresponsibility. The real takeaway from the study, which ought to have been emphasized, was the truly marginal nature of observed personality differences between the participants who refused COVID containment measures and those who eagerly embraced them. Key takeaways. Wearing masks creates an isolating, anonymizing effect that can provide temporary relief from social anxiety. Prior to 2020, mask addiction was recognized in at least some professional circles as a subtype of behavioral addiction or process dependency. Despite slanted media presentations attempting to link it to antisocial personality traits, refusal to wear a mask did not imply any psychological abnormality or pathology. Rational caution versus obsession. Fears of disease and contagion long predate germ theory, but fear of physical sickness, per se, is not always the main driver. In a 2020 article published in the Journal of Obsessive Compulsive and Related Disorders, Dr. Frederick Ardema, a psychologist specializing in obsessive compulsive and related disorders, held up a more historically minded, almost psychoanalytic lens through which fears of COVID might be understood. Dr. Ardema differentiates between exaggerated, almost phobic reactions to potential infection and obsessive-compulsive disorders centered around a more primal dread of contamination. One of the chief signs that something is an obsessive disorder, rather than a phobia or rational but excessive fear, is that obsessive disorders tend to be highly selective and idiosyncratic. As an example, Dr. Ardema cites the case of one of his patients who routinely wore gloves and avoided shaking hands out of obsessional fear of hepatitis C, but showed no heightened concerns about the coronavirus. The line between rational caution regarding illness and obsessive fear of contamination can get very blurry in practice, but the response to COVID, including compulsory masking, clearly hurtled across this line with the pedal to the metal. Many of the measures claiming to be for the control of COVID, especially masking regulations, were highly idiosyncratic, having more in common with obsessive disorders than any rational infection control measure. A prime example of this were requirements to wear face masks when entering a restaurant, but which permitted removal of masks when seated at a table. The same idiosyncrasy applies to every exception that allowed mask removal for brief periods, including while eating and drinking on airplanes or anywhere else. The tendency to treat cloth masks, medical masks, and N95 respirators as being equally capable of meeting mandate requirements is another example. Masking outdoors was never rational, and touching a mask to pull it back enough to sip a drink or take a bite of food, then immediately replacing it, was worse than useless from an infection control standpoint. Idiosyncrasies apparent when viewing masks solely as a public health measure vanish, however, when masking is viewed as an obsessive means of social signaling, psychological manipulation, social control, and coerced symbolic speech. Dr. Ardima suggests that justified concerns to avoid contagion shift towards obsessional fears of contamination the more a pathogen is personified. Many counterproductive COVID-related infection control or safety measures implicitly personified SARS-CoV-2. When it is personified, a pathogen acquires by implication the power to impart mental and spiritual corruption. Efforts to avoid this deeper threat, which spawns a primal dread, are often out of all proportion to the physical danger. Dr. Ardima quotes one particularly self-aware 19th century commentator who describes this primitive sensation of dread. "I have no particular apprehension of contracting smallpox or any other disease I can specify. It is an overpowering feeling that I shall be defiled in some mysterious way that presses me with a force I cannot resist." The many COVID curfews were an obvious example of this, as though the virus will intentionally get naughty citizens who stay out too late or socialize too much. From a rational public health standpoint, curfews simply forced citizens to cram their activities into fewer hours every day, ensuring that more people were out and about and interacting at the same time. Closing bars which serve food, but allowing restaurants which serve alcohol to operate, was another example of this sort of irrational idiosyncrasy. We will go into more detail on some of these in Part 5. A codified scientific veneer, especially when it has intuitional appeal, multiplies the staying power and persuasiveness of sub-rational fears. Perceptive 19th and early 20th century observers drew attention to this. In an 1866 lecture delivered at the Royal Institution in London, simply titled Superstition, the Reverend Charles Kingsley pointed out that man has a unique capacity to organize his folly, erect his superstitions into a science, and create a whole mythology out of his blind fear of the unknown. In his well-timed 2019 book, How Fear Works, psychologist Frank Furedi spells out this difference between science and fear-based science. On the one hand, the term research shows has the character of a ritualistic incantation. It is the modern equivalent of the mandate offered by Holy Scripture. Simultaneously, the absence of evidence does not inhibit advocates from asserting their beliefs, and in many cases the absence of evidence is reinterpreted as proof that the threat is actually far greater than previously believed. Arguments about threats are often founded on a prior conviction rather than discoveries made by science. That is why it is so difficult to distinguish the scientific from the moral in the language of fear. There is also a correlation between affluence and anxiety. In Western societies, it is usually the wealthiest, the most economically and socially secure individuals who tend to be the most concerned for their safety. Masking provided visual validation for a lot of this free-floating anxiety, and not in a good way. Though authorities constantly appealed to science and experts to justify universal compulsory masking and other totalitarian forms of COVID crisis overreach, what they meant by science was very different from the methodology for discovering truths about the physical world. In reality, what they were referring to was the science, which was nothing more than a euphemism for the whole framework of collective underlying beliefs that supported their policies and impositions, including compulsory masking. One of America's greatest 20th and 21st century minds, Thomas Sowell, used his characteristic dry wit to describe the real processes involved when the science is invoked to guide public policy. Experts are often called in not to provide factual information or dispassionate analysis for the purpose of decision-making by responsible officials, but to give political cover for decisions already made and based on other considerations entirely. The shifting of socially consequential decisions from systemic processes involving millions of people making mutual accommodations at their own costs and risks to experts imposing a master plan on all would be problematic even if the experts were free to render their own best judgment. In situations where experts are simply part of the window dressing, concealing arbitrary and even corrupt decisions by others, reliance on what all the experts say about a given issue is extremely risky. Even where the experts are untrammeled, what all the experts are most likely to agree on is the need for using expertise to deal with problems. Dr. Furedi's and Dr. Sowell's analyses were repeatedly borne out during the COVID crisis. Very real socio-legal threats and punishments were used to actively prevent people from making voluntary mutual accommodations regarding masking and other COVID-related preventative measures. At the same time, vague hand-waving appeals to the science were used as moralizing truncheons to end discussion and quell dissent. Key takeaways. Anti-COVID measures, including the rules surrounding masking, had more in common with obsessive disorders than with rational, albeit excessive, fear of infection. Historically, a scientific veneer, the science, and appeals to expertise are routinely used to justify decisions and policies based on everything except actual science. This was also true of compulsory masking during COVID. Sacred values. Public health was a de facto quasi-religion for at least a few people even before COVID. But during COVID, public health fully metastasized into a secular religion, with mask wearing and vaccination as the chief performative rituals. "In Fauci we trust" popped up on numerous products in what was, at best, a semi-satirical allusion to America's national motto, "In God we trust." Widespread acceptance of medical reasons for not wearing a mask as being legitimate and acceptable, coupled with a simultaneous denial of the legitimacy and acceptability of religious reasons for refusal, testified to this transformation. To categorically elevate something's importance over religion is to enshrine it as a form of religion. For example, to permit dental treatment, which by definition requires the removal of masks while denying the removal of masks on religious grounds, is to take for granted that matters of dentistry are more important than matters of religion. The extent to which public health had been exalted was made luminously apparent in May 2020, when the statue of Christ the Redeemer in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, was lit up by a projector to appear as if Jesus was wearing a mask, with #MascaraSalva, Mask Saves, emblazoned on his chest. This was followed in May 2021 by Vaccine Saves, after the vaccination campaign in Brazil commenced in January, with 2 healthcare workers symbolically receiving their shots at the foot of the statue of Christ. Charitable viewers might be inclined to see this as an act of symbolic analogy, or an invocation seeking divine blessing rather than any real worship of public health. But even if we assume such an interpretation to be true, this type of symbolism possessed a very real cutting edge, and testifies to the religious-level fervor that often drove masking. A late 2020 study in the Journal of Social Psychology found that even theoretical intellectual challenges to COVID elimination approaches were met with responses more typically seen when sacred values, e.g., religious beliefs, are questioned. In the study, researchers crafted 2 identical proposals, with the only difference being that one was framed as questioning anti-COVID measures and one was framed as supporting them. One proposal hypothesized that the human suffering caused by COVID-19 elimination efforts outweighed the suffering that would occur if those measures were abandoned, i.e., that the prevention or cure might be worse than the disease, and vice versa. Both proposals contained the same amount of empirically validated information. The only difference was in how the proposal was framed, in what hypothesis was to be investigated. In theory, the 2 proposals should have received identical or nearly identical ratings from reviewers. What actually happened was that not only did participants rate the study proposal framed as questioning anti-COVID measures as less accurate, less methodologically sound, and less valuable to society, but they also rated the researchers personally as being less competent and less trustworthy. Tensions over masking bear a strong resemblance to tensions over religious beliefs because masking in general and compulsory masking in particular implicate many beliefs that people hold sacred. Under American law, religious beliefs are not defined as being limited to traditional organized religions. Rather, religious beliefs include theistic beliefs as well as non-theistic, moral or ethical beliefs as to what is right and wrong, which are sincerely held with the strength of traditional religious views. In other words, the law classifies ultimate ideas about life, purpose, and death, including ideas about death from disease and illness, as religious if they are held with the strength of traditional religious views. In its guidance documents derived from courtroom precedents covered in detail in Part 5 of this book, the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, explains that religion includes not only traditional organized religions such as Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, and Buddhism, but also religious beliefs that are new, uncommon, not part of a formal church or sect, only subscribed to by a small number of people, or that seem illogical or unreasonable to others. A belief is religious for Title VII purposes if it is religious in the person's own scheme of things, i.e., it is a sincere and meaningful belief that occupies a place in the life of its possessor parallel to that filled by God. During the COVID crisis, all of the organic and artificial social pressure, nudges, manipulation, and coercive measures combined to overpower even strong-willed individuals. For those who resisted all these pressures and still refused to put on a mask, some stronger, predominantly internal force was needed to counterbalance these external pressures. This internal force consisted of bedrock beliefs, often instinctually grasped in the heat of the moment. In this highly charged context, refusal to wear a mask was an expression of one's deepest beliefs about authority and the rights of the individual over the collective. It was a declaration of self-ownership, of non-slavery, of the same type of sincerely held religious belief that led Quakers such as William Penn to refuse to uncover their heads as a show of deference to authority. Any symbolic political elements were important and certainly implicated the free speech clause of the First Amendment, but were nevertheless subsidiary to even more bedrock principles that easily meet the threshold for religious beliefs recognized and protected by the First Amendment's free exercise clause. By the same token, the decision to wear a mask could also be based on similarly held sacred values, and doubtless was for many people. Many authors, including Dr. Zimbardo, have written about how individuals are constantly engaged in two-way exchanges with society. They are shaped by it, but also shape it. They adapt to its norms, rules, and prescriptions, but they also define and change them. More than 40 years ago, Václav Havel, a Czech statesman known for his courageous opposition to communism, described the simple dynamic created when people succumb to a totalitarian system of mandated manipulative compliance. They conform to a particular requirement, and in so doing, they themselves perpetuate that requirement. They create through their involvement a general norm, and thus bring pressure to bear on their fellow citizens, and further, so they may learn to be comfortable with their involvement, to identify with it as though it were something natural and inevitable, and ultimately, so they may, with no external urging, come to treat any non-involvement as an abnormality, as arrogance, as an attack on themselves, as a form of dropping out of society. This process described by Václav Havel is exactly what happened with masks during COVID. People reacted so strongly to differences in masking or non-masking, not primarily because of any perceived infection control risk, but because the masked or unmasked person's mere presence implied a negation of their sacred values and implicitly reproached their own actions. Masking is so contentious because it taps directly into people's most basic beliefs and assumptions, putting irreconcilable conflicts between them very literally in your face. Someone wearing a mask who has adopted the beliefs that masks work and are necessary to protect against SARS-CoV-2, that all rules should be presumed lawful until proven otherwise, or that their mask wearing is a manifestation of them being a good person, will naturally perceive an unmasked face as a form of assault on their worldview, their character, their body, or all three at once, and react accordingly. A similar effect and reaction can occur within someone refusing to put on a mask when they are ordered to do so. For many people during COVID, refusal to put on a mask in the face of intense social pressure, directives from authority figures, and pseudo-legal pressure to conform was an important symbolic declaration of their deepest beliefs about authority and the rights of the individual over the collective, a collective selfishly asserting ownership over their body by demanding they put on a face covering. In light of this, is it any wonder that 2021 was the worst year on record for altercations on airplanes, and that 4,290 of the 5,981 incidents of unruly behavior during air travel were mask-related? Making masks mandatory also attached executive and public health authorities' sense of power and prestige to the act, making masking into an even more prominent ideological symbol than before. Many institutions, especially those accustomed to a high degree of control, such as correctional facilities and the armed forces, not only drank their own Kool-Aid with regard to the evidence and ideology behind masking, but also came to view compulsory masking as representative of their overall authority. Any challenge to masking, in turn, was seen as an existential threat to that authority. Anything less than total compliance was deemed subversive and unacceptable. In the Stanford prison experiment, the guards instituted a rule that prisoners must eat at mealtimes and only at mealtimes. When a new prisoner, prisoner 416, refused to eat, the guards saw this act of disobedience as an existential threat to their authority, because such refusal could trigger further challenges to their authority from the others, who until now had traded rebellion for docility. To protect their authority, the guards escalated their abusive behavior against the prisoners even further. The guards successfully turned several of the other prisoners against the new rebel by imposing collective punishment, taking away everyone's ability to have visitors, and blamed it on prisoner 416's refusal to obey orders. Depressingly, the rest of the prisoners fell for this tactic to one extent or another, leaving their most effective resistor isolated at a time when their collective support might have reversed the downward trajectory of the entire experiment, or at least their experiences within it. Instead of getting angry with the guards for unjustly and illogically making an arbitrary connection between their own visiting privileges and someone else's refusal to eat, most of the other prisoners got angry with the troublemaker. The guards also intuitively made use of the psychological tools described earlier. For example, they ordered the other prisoners to tell prisoner 416 why he was selfish, thus getting the other prisoners to publicly commit to their compliance in the same manner as the #IWearAMaskBecause campaign got people to publicly commit to their compliance with masks. Once the practice of mask wearing took hold, deference to authority was just one of the psychological forces which helped perpetuate it. Confirmation bias, the propensity for people to look for what confirms their beliefs and ignore what contradicts their beliefs, motivated reasoning, selective skepticism, not applying the same standard of proof to things we already agree with, post hoc justification, and the sunk cost fallacy all kicked in and further hampered honest investigation of the evidence. Never underestimate the power of confirmation bias and motivated reasoning, conclusions wandering in search of arguments. Many people who pushed masks and other anti-COVID measures would pay a high psychic price in self-image alone to admit that they were wrong. Politicians, judges, and public health officials are even less likely to admit that they were wrong for the same reason. The cost is high. Admitting a mistake to oneself is hard enough. Publicly doing so is even more rare and takes a degree of moral courage matching or exceeding that required to never succumb to social pressures in the first place. In particular, people who coerced or pressured others into wearing masks will have a strong internal incentive to justify themselves and to use the alternative escape route, retrospectively minimizing the extent to which they coerced and pressured others. This means that a large portion of the administrative class who initiated, perpetuated, and enforced coerced masking is unlikely to ever admit even to themselves the extent to which they did so or that they were wrong to do so. People who refuse to wear masks are not immune to these same self-justification incentives. I do not claim to be immune to these things either, and that is part of my point. No one is. These features of human nature are held in common by all of us. If no one is immune to these things, ask yourself these questions when trying to decide who is right. Who is trying to persuade you? Who is trying to control you? And which side of the argument has been willing to sacrifice more of their own material well-being for what they believe? Key takeaways. Public health during COVID took on the hallmarks typically associated with a religion. Compulsory masking for COVID was and remains so controversial because it implicates core sacred values and beliefs. Once mask wearing was made compulsory, many authorities came to view refusal to comply as a personal affront, as well as an existential threat to their overall legitimacy, and responded accordingly. Mask Psychology Conclusion. The experts know less than you think. The masses are much less likely than the elites to think that they should be overruling people whose stake and whose relevant knowledge for the issue at hand are far greater than their own. Moreover, the masses are less likely to have the rhetorical skills to conceal from others or from themselves that this is what they are doing. Thomas Sowell, Intellectuals and Society, 2011. Academics, professionals, intellectuals, and the intelligentsia tend to confuse lack of special knowledge or a lower knowledge per capita with having adequate knowledge to justify decision-making dictates. An enthusiastic amateur may often surpass an expert on a particular matter even within that expert's broader field, and when it comes to issues outside of their expertise, experts are no better off than the rest of us. Herein lies a strong clue to answering the rhetorical question of why doctors wear face masks. The ritual of mask wearing for infection control came into use late in the 19th century, when germ theory was in its infancy, and doctors were implementing every practice they could think of which intuition suggested might help decrease germ transmission. Medical schools and public health programs do not offer classes in masks. Masks are typically just one small portion of classes on infection control, a few PowerPoint slides, or at most a 1-hour lecture. There is simply too much other material to cover in these programs to permit going into depth on such a niche issue. As we've already seen, the psychology harnessed by mask wearing is enough on its own to make the practice self-perpetuating in the absence of scientific evidence. These psychological forces are strong enough to perpetuate mask wearing even when the practice is contrary to the clear and convincing weight of scientific evidence. Generations of doctors have been taught by respected mentors and other authority figures that they should wear masks to prevent disease transmission, and the longer a doctor has been in practice, the longer he or she has routinely worn a mask. Given that doctors as a group are no more immune to behavioral psychology than any other portion of the population, imagine the effect on belief of decades-long, rigorous, ritualistic, socially enforced, and socially validated mask wearing. In fact, doctors were routinely penalized for not wearing masks in many situations. Sound familiar? The real reasons doctors have been wearing masks are largely the same reasons everyone else started wearing masks for COVID. The methods used to push face masks and other COVID-19 mitigation measures upon the general population were direct descendants of trailblazing psychological research on obedience, compliance, and social influence conducted by Solomon Asch, Stanley Milgram, Philip Zimbardo, their contemporaries, and their successors. Everything from gradual successive steps to diffusion of responsibility. 15 days to flatten the curve. Essential versus non-essential. Now the masks. Now the vaccine, but you still have to wear the masks. The people making the scientific recommendations were not the ones issuing the actual orders, so officials' pet scientists could say they were just issuing recommendations, and the officials could claim to simply be following the science. The people issuing punitive citations for non-compliance were not the same ones who imposed the regulations. The people conducting inspections without warrants were not the same ones enforcing the inspector's findings by closing down businesses or arresting the owners for trying to earn a living under the new normal. Collective punishments were decreed in the name of safety and public health. Neighborhoods and businesses were locked down. The Stanford prison experiment's dynamics were writ large, as the people being hurt by lockdowns were incessantly told to blame their objecting and non-compliant neighbors instead of the people who were actually hurting them. The moralizing dimension of mask mandates was conveyed by euphemistic language which turned compliance with abuse into a form of virtue. People who didn't wear their masks right were not showing enough mask discipline, for example. Contrary to the strident and vitriolic moralizations of politicians, pundits, and televised public health officials, compliance with mask wearing was never a route to ending the COVID crisis, only to deepening it. Compulsory mask wearing was ideology masquerading as public health. It was coerced symbolic speech under the pretext of infection control. Voluntarily giving an inch with masks drastically increased compliance with other COVID crisis control measures, including lockdowns, and led directly to giving a mile with compulsory vaccinations. It is not just a mask, and it never was.